The kingdom of Eldoria had always whispered of dragons. Tales of their fiery majesty filled the songs of bards, and their images adorned the banners of noble houses. But for common folk like Kael, dragons were little more than legends, creatures glimpsed only from afar, their wings blotting out the sun as they soared over the mountains beyond reach. That was until the night Kael stumbled upon something he was never meant to find. The ruins in the Whispering Woods. It began like any other evening. The streets of Eldoria bustled with merchants closing their stalls, the scent of spiced meats and fresh bread wafting through the air. But Kael had no silver to buy food, no home to return to. An orphaned scavenger, he lived by his wits and speed, darting through alleyways and slipping unseen into places where he didn't belong. That night, hunger gnawed at him more fiercely than usual. He knew of a place, the ruins of an old temple deep in the Whispering Woods. It was forbidden, of course. The elders claimed it was cursed, that those who entered never returned. But Kael had long learned that myths were just stories meant to keep people afraid. With the moon barely a sliver in the sky, he slipped past the city walls, sprinting through the forest shadows. The ruins came into view, a crumbling temple, its marble pillars entwined with vines, the remnants of murals barely visible beneath centuries of wear. He moved carefully, his heart pounding, picking through the debris in search of anything valuable. Then he saw it. Nestled in the heart of the ruins, half buried beneath shattered stone, was an egg unlike anything he had ever seen. It was black, but not simply dark. It seemed to drink in the surrounding light, the surface pulsing with veins of crimson fire. It radiated heat, yet when Kael reached out, it did not burn. Instead, a strange warmth spread through his fingers, traveling up his arm and settling deep in his chest. He knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that this egg was meant for him. The hunters arrive. Before he could marvel further, the ground trembled beneath his feet. A low growl echoed through the ruins, followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots against stone. Kael barely had time to duck behind a fallen pillar before they emerged. Dragon hunters. There were 3 of them, clad in dark leather armor, their cloaks adorned with the sigil of the Black Talon, an infamous group of poachers who made their fortune capturing and selling dragons to the highest bidder. Their leader, a scarred man with one eye and a wickedly curved blade at his hip, strode toward the egg with purpose. "Are you sure about this?" one of the hunters asked, his voice uncertain. "They say Shadowflames are cursed." "Superstition," the leader scoffed. "A dragon's a dragon, and this one will fetch more gold than the king's crown." Kael held his breath. He had no idea what a Shadowflame was, but he knew he couldn't let these men take the egg. His fingers tightened around it as the hunters drew closer. Then, as if sensing his fear, the egg pulsed violently. A shockwave of heat erupted from its shell, sending a gust of energy outward. The hunters staggered back, cursing. Kael's heart pounded. He had to move. Now, the escape. Gripping the egg tightly, he bolted from his hiding place. The hunters shouted, their footsteps thundering behind him. Kael leapt over broken stones and ducked beneath low-hanging vines, his breath ragged as he sprinted through the forest. Arrows whistled past his ears. One grazed his shoulder, searing pain ripping through him, but he kept running. The trees blurred around him, the egg in his arms growing hotter by the second. Then, as he stumbled into a clearing, something extraordinary happened. The egg cracked. A blinding light filled the forest as the shell splintered apart. From within, a creature unfurled, small, sleek, and covered in obsidian scales that shimmered like the night sky. Its wings, though still damp, stretched wide, and its red eyes locked onto Kael's. The hunters crashed into the clearing, just as the newborn dragon opened its mouth. A torrent of black fire erupted from its tiny throat, scorching the earth, sending the hunters reeling in terror. The leader barely had time to curse before he was forced to dive for cover. Kael stared, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. The dragon, no bigger than a house cat, had just unleashed a power that could turn men to ash. And yet, as the fire dissipated, the tiny creature nuzzled against him, letting out a soft, purring growl. A bond had been forged. Kael did not understand how, but he knew one thing. This dragon was his, and he was its. And nothing in Eldoria, not kings, not hunters, not the laws of the land, would ever tear them apart. Chapter 2. The Hatchling's Fury. Kael sat beneath the thick canopy of the Whispering Woods, his back against a moss-covered log, cradling the dragon in his arms. The tiny creature had fallen asleep almost instantly after its fiery outburst, its small body warm against his chest. His mind raced, struggling to process everything that had just happened. A dragon. A real, living dragon. And it had chosen him. His shoulder ached where the hunter's arrow had grazed him, but the pain was a distant thing compared to the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He needed to get further from the ruins. If the hunters were still searching for him, it wouldn't be long before they picked up his trail. The hatchling stirred, shifting slightly as its crimson eyes fluttered open. It blinked at him, then let out a soft rumbling chirp, stretching its wings. Though small, its claws looked razor-sharp, and its tail flicked through the air with practiced precision, as though it had already mastered control over its body. Kael swallowed hard. This wasn't just any dragon. This was a Shadowflame. Legends whispered of their existence, but no one had seen one in centuries. Unlike most dragons who wielded fire in its pure form, Shadowflames were said to control something far more dangerous. Black fire, a flame that consumed not just flesh, but light itself. And now, one of them sat in his lap. Umbra, Kael muttered under his breath, testing the name on his tongue. The dragon lifted its head, tilting it curiously at him. He chuckled softly. Yeah, I think that fits. Umbra huffed in agreement, but the moment of peace was short-lived. The distant sound of voices shattered the quiet, sending a jolt of fear through Kael's body. The hunters were still searching for him. He scrambled to his feet, clutching Umbra tightly. He had to keep moving. The chase begins. Kael darted through the trees, his bare feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. He had lived most of his life as a street rat, stealing and slipping away unnoticed, but this was different. If the hunters caught him, they wouldn't just take Umbra, they'd kill him. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by the snap of branches nearby. Kael's heart hammered in his chest. They were closing in. He skidded to a halt as he reached the edge of a rocky slope, his eyes darting for an escape route. The terrain ahead was treacherous, a steep descent leading to a shallow river below. He could risk the jump, but there was no telling if he'd make it to the other side unscathed. A voice behind him growled, "There he is." Kael had no time to think. He tightened his grip around Umbra, took a deep breath, and jumped. The wind rushed past his ears as he tumbled down the slope, jagged rocks scraping against his skin. He hit the ground hard, rolling through the dirt before splashing into the river. The cold shock of water stole his breath, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Kicking frantically, he swam toward the opposite bank. Above him, the hunters skidded to a stop at the cliff's edge. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw, aimed a crossbow at him. Kael barely had time to react before a jet of black fire erupted from his arms. No, not from him, from Umbra. The tiny dragon had woken, and with a furious snarl, it unleashed a stream of darkness that ripped through the air, striking the hunter's weapon. The crossbow disintegrated in his hands, consumed by the unnatural fire. Kael barely had time to stare before he felt himself dragged under the current. The river had picked up speed, sweeping him downstream. He thrashed wildly, barely keeping his grip on Umbra as they were carried away. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the glow of red eyes, Umbra's gaze locked onto his, unblinking. Then everything went black. The awakening. Kael woke to the feeling of warmth pressed against his chest. For a brief moment, he thought he was still dreaming. Then the aches in his body reminded him otherwise. He groaned, his fingers curling into damp earth as he pushed himself upright. The river had carried him far. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious. The surrounding forest looked unfamiliar, the trees darker, the air heavier. Umbra sat beside him, watching him closely. "You saved me," Kael murmured, rubbing his face. His clothes were torn, his body covered in bruises, but he was alive. Umbra chirped softly and nudged his cheek with its snout. Kael let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "Guess we make a good team, huh?" The dragon purred in response, but their relief was short-lived. A shadow moved through the trees ahead. Kael stiffened, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his body was still too weak. He reached for a rock, the only weapon he could find. The figure stepped closer, and as the light filtered through the trees, Kael realized it wasn't a hunter. It was an old man. He was tall and gaunt, his long silver hair falling past his shoulders. A cloak of dark blue draped over his thin frame, and his piercing eyes, too sharp, too knowing, settled on Kael. "You should not be here," the man said, his voice deep and filled with something ancient. Kael swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to Umbra. The dragon let out a warning growl, but the man showed no fear. "You carry a Shadowflame," he said quietly, "and that means your life will never be the same." Kael's grip on the rock tightened. "If you're here to take him, you'll have to kill me first." The man chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "If I wanted to kill you, boy, you'd already be dead." Kael didn't move. The man took a slow step forward. "I am Orin, and I am the last dragon sage in Eldoria." Kael blinked. He had heard that name before. Orin the outcast, the mad sage. A man who had once been one of the kingdom's greatest dragon scholars before being exiled for reasons no one dared speak of. Orin's eyes darkened. "If you wish to survive, you must come with me. The hunters will not stop until they have your dragon. And if you do not learn how to protect it—" He paused, letting the words sink in. "Then you will both die." Kael felt the weight of his choices press upon him. His entire life had changed in the span of a single night. He had no home, no allies, only Umbra. And now an exiled dragon sage was offering him a way to fight back. He looked down at the dragon curled at his feet. Umbra's red eyes met his, filled with silent trust. Kael exhaled slowly. Then he looked back at Orin and nodded. "All right," he said, "teach me." Orin smiled faintly. "Then let us begin." As Kael followed the old man deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of what he didn't yet know. But one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. Chapter 3: Trial by Fire. The journey to Orin's refuge was long and treacherous. Kael followed the old dragon sage through the thick, mist-laden forest, his limbs aching from exhaustion. Umbra, despite being barely a day old, moved with startling agility, leaping effortlessly over roots and fallen logs. His fiery red eyes flicked back toward Kael every so often, checking to see if he was keeping up. The deeper they ventured, the stranger the forest became. The trees were ancient, their gnarled roots twisting like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something more: magic. It was a subtle hum beneath Kael's skin, an electric charge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Orin walked ahead in silence, his long cloak barely rustling as he moved. Kael had 1,000 questions, but exhaustion and wariness kept his tongue still. He didn't trust this man. Not yet. But he had little choice. After what felt like hours, they reached a break in the trees, revealing a cavernous rock formation nestled within a valley. A waterfall cascaded from the cliffs above, its roaring waters feeding into a serene pool that glowed faintly under the moonlight. Orin turned, his sharp gaze settling on Kael. "This is where we will train." Kael exhaled, rubbing his sore arms. "Great. Do I at least get some food first?" The old man smirked. "If you survive your first lesson, perhaps." Kael frowned, glancing at Umbra, who was now perched on a rock, watching intently. "You're joking, right?" Orin said nothing. Instead, he lifted his staff and slammed it against the ground. A gust of force erupted from beneath Kael's feet, sending him sprawling backward. He barely had time to process what had happened before the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing smoldering embers. Kael scrambled back, eyes wide. What the hell was that? Orin strode forward, his presence commanding. "You claim to be bonded to a Shadowflame dragon. But tell me, boy, do you understand what that means?" Kael's pulse raced. Do you understand what it means to wield fire born of darkness?" Orin's voice thundered, his piercing gaze locking onto Kael's. "What you possess is not just power, it is destruction incarnate. It will consume you if you do not learn control." Kael swallowed hard. He felt the weight of Orin's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. The old sage stepped closer. "You have two choices: run and be hunted for the rest of your days, or learn to control the fire that now burns within you." Kael clenched his fists. There was no choice. Not really. He looked at Umbra, who let out a soft growl, eyes glowing with something that almost looked like pride. Kael exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Teach me." A slow smile spread across Orin's face. "Then let us begin." The first trial, the bond between them. The next morning, Kael woke to the sound of crackling flames. He sat up groggily, his body still sore from the previous day's events. Umbra was curled up beside him, his small form rising and falling with each slow breath. But as Kael stretched, the dragon's eyes snapped open instantly, alert. It was strange how deeply they already seemed connected. Orin was waiting for him near the edge of the waterfall, standing beside a circle of carved runes glowing faintly in the earth. Without a word, the old sage gestured for Kael to step inside. Kael hesitated. "What is this?" "A test of trust," Orin replied. "The bond between you and your dragon must be absolute. If it is not, neither of you will survive what is to come." Kael glanced at Umbra, who had padded forward, his tail flicking curiously. "And how does this work?" Kael asked, wary. Orin lifted his staff, and the runes flared to life. Suddenly, the ground beneath Kael disappeared. For a brief, terrifying moment, he was falling into nothingness. The world blurred around him, and panic seized his chest. He opened his mouth to scream, but then something caught him. Claws. Umbra had moved in an instant, diving after him, catching Kael's tunic in his sharp talons. They plummeted together through endless darkness, wind rushing around them. Kael struggled against his fear. He barely had time to process where they were before he felt something stir deep inside him. The connection. He could feel Umbra, not just as a presence beside him, but within his very soul. He could feel the dragon's instincts, the way its heart pounded against its ribcage, the rush of power coursing through its small but mighty body. And then he wasn't just falling with Umbra. He was falling as Umbra. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't just bonded to a dragon. Their connection went deeper than that. He could see through Umbra's eyes. He could feel the strength in his wings, the way the wind resisted against him. For a split second he panicked, trapped inside a body that wasn't his own. But then, the fear melted away. Because this was what it meant to be bonded. Kael opened his mind fully, embracing the connection. And just like that, Umbra spread his wings. The plummet turned into a graceful glide, the darkness parting around them. Kael could feel the dragon's movements as if they were his own. They soared upward, breaking through the void. And then, suddenly Kael was back in his own body, gasping for breath, the world stabilizing around him. He was on solid ground again, kneeling in the rune circle. Orin stood over him, watching. Kael blinked rapidly, heart still hammering. Orin's gaze was unreadable. "So, you are more than just a lucky thief," Kael panted, looking at Umbra, who sat beside him, wings folded neatly. "We're connected," Kael whispered. "Truly connected." Orin nodded. "Indeed, and that is only the beginning." The second trial, the fire within. The days passed in a grueling blur. Orin pushed Kael and Umbra to their limits, forcing them to hone their bond, to move in perfect unison. Kael learned that Umbra's flames weren't just fire, they were something else entirely. A fire that didn't just burn, a fire that devoured. He had to control it, or it would consume everything. The first time he attempted to summon it himself, the power nearly overwhelmed him. His hands burned, but not with pain, with raw, untamed power. "You must not fear it," Orin told him sternly. "Fire feeds on fear. Control your emotions, and you will control the flames." Kael gritted his teeth, focusing. He felt the fire deep within him, felt the same heat he had sensed in Umbra's soul. And then, a spark. A flicker of black flame curled around his fingertips. For the first time, Kael understood. He was no mere dragon bonded, he was something more, and that terrified him. A dark omen. As the training continued, Orin grew more watchful, his expression troubled. One night, as Kael sat by the fire, he finally asked, "What's wrong?" Orin hesitated. Then he spoke the words Kael never expected. "There is a prophecy," he said slowly. "A prophecy of a Shadowflame reborn, a dragon and rider who would bring either salvation or destruction." Kael's breath caught. Orin met his gaze. "And I fear, Kael, that you are at the center of it." Chapter 4, The Betrayal. The fire crackled softly in the cave's hearth, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Kael sat cross-legged on the ground, Umbra curled beside him, his dark scales absorbing the fire's glow. Orin stood at the entrance of the cave, gazing into the distance, his posture rigid with tension. Kael had not been able to sleep since Orin had spoken of the prophecy. A Shadowflame reborn. A dragon and rider who would bring either salvation or destruction. The words haunted him. He clenched his fists, staring at the embers before him. "You think I'm the one from the prophecy?" Orin didn't answer immediately. The old sage finally turned to face him, his eyes unreadable. "I think the possibility exists." Kael exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his unruly hair. "That's not an answer." "No," Orin agreed. "It isn't." Umbra stirred beside Kael, lifting his head slightly. His red eyes flickered with concern, as if he could sense his rider's unrest. Kael sighed and scratched beneath Umbra's chin. "I don't want to be part of a prophecy." "Prophecies don't care about what we want," Orin said quietly. "They only care about what will be." Kael set his jaw. "Then I'll prove them wrong." Orin watched him for a long moment before he nodded. "Perhaps." Silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, the old sage turned and disappeared into the darkness outside. Kael watched him go, unease curling in his gut. A glimpse of hope. Despite the heavy weight of the prophecy looming over him, Kael and Umbra's training continued. Days passed, then weeks. The bond between them grew stronger, so strong that Kael could feel Umbra's emotions as if they were his own. The dragon's anger when Kael failed, his exhilaration when they succeeded, his hunger before every meal, his exhaustion when training drained him. It was more than just a connection. It was as if their souls had fused into one. And for the first time, Kael truly felt like he belonged. But peace never lasted long. It came in the form of a visitor. Orin had left the cave that morning, as he often did, leaving Kael and Umbra to spar in the open valley. Kael had just finished blocking one of Umbra's practice swipes when a shadow loomed over them. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. Kael spun, reaching for the dagger at his waist, but the figure raised their hands in surrender. "I mean no harm," came a smooth voice. The stranger stepped forward, and as the sunlight hit them, Kael's breath caught in his throat. It was a girl. She was tall and slender, clad in armor that gleamed like polished silver. A sword rested at her hip, and a cloak of deep blue fluttered behind her in the wind. But it wasn't her attire that caught Kael's attention. It was her eyes, sharp, intelligent, dangerous, and yet strangely familiar. The girl bowed slightly, her expression unreadable. "My name is Princess Lysara of Eldoria." Kael tensed at the name. "A princess? Here?" She studied him closely. "And you are the one bonded to the Shadowflame." Kael stiffened. He had no idea how she knew about him, or Umbra, but he wasn't about to confirm anything. "Who's asking?" "I told you, Princess Lysara." Her lips curved slightly. "I'm here to help you." Kael narrowed his eyes. "Help me," Lysara nodded. "You don't know it yet, but you and your dragon may be the only ones who can save Eldoria." Kael laughed dryly. "Save Eldoria? I'm pretty sure the entire kingdom wants me dead." She hesitated. "Not the entire kingdom." Kael folded his arms. "I'm listening." Lysara took a slow breath. "The king, my father, is dying, and when he does, my brother, Prince Dane, will take the throne." Kael frowned. He didn't know much about the royal family, but he had heard enough to know Dane was a monster. Ruthless, power-hungry, and cruel beyond measure. The thought of him ruling Eldoria sent a chill down Kael's spine. Lysara's expression darkened. "My brother believes in absolute control. He sees dragons as weapons, nothing more than tools for conquest." Kael's stomach twisted. He had seen firsthand what the kingdom did to dragons, capturing them, taming them, breaking them. Lysara's gaze met his. "If he ascends the throne, he will enslave every dragon in Eldoria, including your Shadowflame." Kael's breath hitched. Umbra let out a low growl, sensing his unease. Lysara took a step forward. "But if we work together, we can stop him." Kael studied her carefully. Every instinct screamed at him not to trust her. She was a princess, one of them, and yet she had come here alone. She had risked her life just to find him. More importantly, her words rang with truth. If Dane became king, every dragon, including Umbra, would be in danger, and Kael would never let that happen. His jaw tightened. "What's the plan?" Lysara exhaled in relief. "There's a rebellion forming. Fighters, mages, even former soldiers who have seen what my brother truly is. If you and your dragon join us, we will have the power to strike against the capital." Kael hesitated. Orin had warned him to stay hidden. That if the world knew of his bond with Umbra, everyone would try to use them. But if he did nothing, Dane would win, and that was something he could never allow. Kael looked at Umbra. The dragon's red eyes gleamed with something fierce, determination. Kael turned back to Lysara. "We'll help," he said. "But if you betray me, princess," Lysara smirked, "you'll burn me alive?" Kael's lips curled into a grin. "Something like that." Lysara nodded. "Then let's go." The trap. They rode toward the capital under the cover of night. Lysara had secured safe passage through the outer villages, where loyalists to the rebellion had provided them shelter. The journey was long, but every mile brought them closer to toppling a tyrant. Kael had started to trust Lysara, and that was his first mistake, because as they entered the outskirts of the capital, something felt wrong. Umbra, who had been quiet for most of the journey, suddenly stiffened. His wings flared slightly, his gaze flicking through the darkness. Kael's instincts screamed at him. Something was coming. And then, the torches lit up, hundreds of them. Surrounding them, Kael's blood ran cold. Armed soldiers emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn. And at the front of them, sitting atop a massive armored warhorse, was Prince Dane. His cruel smile glowed in the torchlight. "Well, well," he said. "Look what my dear sister has brought me." Kael turned to Lysara. She stood motionless. Her eyes, so full of fire before, were now empty, cold, distant. Kael's heart plummeted. "No," he whispered. You wouldn't." Lysara didn't answer. She simply stepped back. And that was when Kael realized he had walked straight into a trap. Chapter 5. The Awakening. Kael's entire world collapsed in an instant. The torches flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the faces of the soldiers encircling him. Hundreds of armored men, weapons glinting in the firelight, stood in perfect formation, cutting off every possible escape route. And at the center of it all was Prince Dane, seated atop his warhorse, a Smurf salute victory playing on his lips. Kael's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. Not because of the soldiers, not because of Dane, but because of her. Princess Lysara, she had led him here, she had betrayed him. Kael's gaze locked onto hers, desperate for some kind of explanation. Anything that would make this something other than what it was. But her face was unreadable, her eyes cold as steel. "Why?" His voice barely came out, his throat dry as sand. Lysara hesitated. For a split second, something flickered in her gaze. Guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "You think you're the only one who cares about dragons?" she said, her voice low, almost mournful. "You don't know what my father has done, the horrors my brother will bring if he takes the throne." Kael clenched his fists. "Then why turn me in?" Lysara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because it's the only way." The words made no sense. How could handing him over to Dane, a man who wanted to enslave dragons, be the only way? Dane chuckled, watching the exchange like an amused spectator. "Oh, how I love a tragic reunion." His eyes, dark and predatory, locked onto Kael. "And you?" The Shadowflame rider himself. "I must admit I expected more." Kael felt Umbra before he even saw him move. The dragon's body tensed beside him, his scales pulsing with heat. He was ready to strike, to unleash hell upon the soldiers. But something held him back. Kael didn't know if it was instinct or some unseen force binding him in place, but he knew one thing. They wouldn't make it out of this alive, not without a plan. He had to think. The unseen chains. Dane swung down from his warhorse, his long cloak billowing behind him. He walked forward casually, his soldiers parting for him like obedient dogs. "I'll admit," Dane continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "when Lysara first came to me with this little plan of hers, I thought she had lost her mind. But I must say, she has done well." Kael shot a look at Lysara, whose face remained blank. Dane's eyes gleamed. "A Shadowflame dragon, the last of its kind. Do you have any idea what that means?" Kael didn't respond. He didn't need to. Dane's smile widened. "You think you're bonded to this creature, that it's yours. But the truth is, it was never meant for you." A shiver crawled down Kael's spine. "That dragon," Dane whispered, stepping closer, "isn't just any Shadowflame. It is royalty, a creature of prophecy, one that was born to serve me." Kael's pulse thundered in his ears. Lies. They had to be lies. But then, he felt it. A sudden weight pressed against his chest, as if something unseen was wrapping around him, constricting, squeezing. His breath caught, and beside him, Umbra let out a pained snarl. The dragon's body convulsed, his wings trembling, his bright red eyes dimmed, flickering with an unnatural darkness. No. Kael staggered forward, reaching for his dragon, but stopped cold as an invisible force yanked him backward. He choked on a strangled gasp, his limbs freezing as if bound by iron chains. Dane tilted his head. "Ah, there it is." Kael's mind reeled. What was happening? Lysara stepped forward. The royal family has always had a bond with Shadowflame dragons, she said quietly. It's why they were hunted, why they were nearly wiped from existence. Dane chuckled. And now the last one belongs to me. The pressure increased. Kael felt Umbra slipping away, his very soul being pried apart from his dragons. No, no. He fought against the unseen force, gritting his teeth, every muscle in his body screaming in defiance. Umbra let out a shrieking roar, his claws digging into the earth, his body writhing. He was fighting it too. Their bond, it was being severed. And Kael had never felt anything more horrifying in his life. No, Kael roared, his vision blurring. He's mine, Dane smirked. Not anymore. The final snap of power cracked through the air like a thunderclap. Kael collapsed to the ground, gasping, his body trembling. And before him Umbra turned to face him. But his eyes, his bright red eyes, were gone. Now they were nothing but empty darkness. And when the dragon bared his teeth, it was not in recognition, it was in obedience. To Dane. Kael's heart shattered. The fall of a rider, Lysara turned away, her face unreadable. Dane stepped forward, resting a gloved hand on Umbra's head. The dragon didn't flinch, he accepted it. Kael forced himself to breathe. He was shaking, his hands digging into the dirt. You stole him. His voice barely sounded like his own. Dane smiled. No, Kael, I just took back what was always mine. Kael wanted to kill him. He wanted to burn everything around him, but he couldn't. His fire was gone, his bond was gone. Everything he had fought for, everything he had become, was gone. Dane turned to his soldiers. Take him to the dungeons. I want him alive. The soldiers moved in. Kael didn't fight. He couldn't. His body was empty. His soul was hollow. He barely even felt it as the shackles clamped around his wrists. He barely even heard the jeers of the soldiers. He barely even registered the cold realization that he had lost. And as they dragged him away, Umbra did not follow. The dragon remained at Dane's side, motionless, a loyal beast to a new master. Kael's vision blurred. He had lost everything. But as he was thrown into the darkness of the dungeons, one final thought clawed its way into his mind. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And when he came back, when he rose from the ashes, he would burn them all. To be continued in part 2.